If you have ever done everything you could think of to improve your baby feeding situation and nothing worked, this episode is for you. If you have ever met with an IBCLC as you were told you should to try to get to the bottom of your baby feeding difficulties and still you struggled, this episode is for you. You are going to love this redemptive breastfeeding story from somebody who has become a real life friend to me and took her challenge and turned it around to make sure that other people don't have to struggle as much as she did. So welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, an international board certified lactation consultant and certified childbirth educator on a mission to explore breastfeeding struggles and triumphs through the lens of systemic medical and cultural barriers. Enjoy. Hi, Kate. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes.
Hi, Lo. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're here. We met in real life. Was it last week?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so you are in my area. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and your family, however much information you would like to give.
Sure, and before I start, I've now listened to a bunch of episodes of the Milk Making Minutes, and I just wanna thank you for providing this space. I think that birth stories are so common, and, telling birth stories is so necessary and important, but I think breastfeeding tends to get lost in the shuffle, and I think telling breastfeeding stories, body feeding stories is equally as important. So thank you again for providing this space. It's really great.
Oh, thank you so much. You know, one of the reasons that I wanted to do this was because every time I told people what I did, they would immediately tell me their baby feeding stories, whether it was the amazing ones where they really proud of what they had accomplished with body feeding, or the ones where they still held some sadness or grief. And it didn't matter if they were a brand new mom or if they had been a parent for 50 years, people want to tell both their birth and their baby feeding stories. There's something very visceral about it. So I really appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so my name is Kate, and I live in Western Massachusetts with my husband and my two kids. One is 4.5, and the other is 1.5.
Yeah, great. So still pretty little.
Still pretty little.
Yeah, all right. So I want to take you back to your childhood. You've probably heard me ask this on the podcast before, and have you describe what your exposure to baby feeding was before you were even thinking about being a parent as a.
Such a great question, and one I think that we need to ask more people. I had no exposure to baby feeding, no exposure to newborns even. I just didn't have locally with newborn in my life. Um, I actually was breastfed. My mom breastfed both my brother and me, but that's not even something that came up until I think right before my first son was born. It just, like, however, never came up. But I don't have a very big family, there weren't babies around, and so my baby feeding experience, even bottles included, was, non-existent.
Mm. Wow. So how did the topic of how your mom fed you come up?
To be honest, I can't remember. I think I started asking some questions, and she had exclusively breastfed both my brother and me, but she really struggled with my brother a lot. I was a much smoother experience for her. My brother was a failure to thrive. You know, in
Mm.
retrospect, I'm stoked she did it with me after probably a pretty nerve-wracking first experience with my brother. But my mom doesn't even remember how long she nursed us for. She doesn't remember a lot of those details, but I think we were both breastfed for at least a few months, if not more.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting about that is it is a good reminder to all of us that these decisions feel so critical in the moment. You really sometimes feel like it's a matter of life or death. It's going to impact down the line extensively. And there are going to be many more difficult decisions we make as our children
Mhm.
get older about approaches to discipline or how we support them through difficult situations, or trying to figure out and navigate neurodiversity or social struggles that they may have. And these decisions that we have to encounter as our children grow, the weight of those tend to take over the decision about how we feed our babies or what's our next best step given our struggles. And I think it is good for those of us who are kind of in the thick of the postpartum period or still feeding babies to recognize it feels really hard right now, but in 30 or 40 years, I might not even remember how long I breastfed my baby.
It's so true. It's a really good perspective to keep in mind.
Yeah. Both
Mhm.
balancing it feels hard now and it's not always going to feel. Yeah.
Oh, that's definitely true.
Okay, so then as you were preparing for your own pregnancy and births, did you do anything to prepare for baby feeding as well?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start by saying I had a very challenging journey to get to my first baby. I went through many rounds of IVF. It was
Mm,
long and grueling, and shaped how I felt about pregnancy, and it still to this day shapes how I feel about motherhood.
mm,
So I came into this with I don't wanna say baggage because that's the wrong word, but I came in with a perspective and some feelings, that
mhm,
were unique to my experience, and so I actually in terms of baby feeding, I knew I wanted to breastfeed. But I had never given it much thought. It was just like, "This is something I'm going to do. I'm gonna have a baby and I'm going to breastfeed." And I didn't even know that much about the benefits of breastfeeding, and I didn't ask myself, "Oh, why do I wanna do this instead of bottle feeding? Why do I wanna breastfeed?" I had never given it that much thought. Um, it sort of felt reflexive to me, and I went took a breastfeeding class at my hospital before my baby was born, and so I thought, "I'm ahead of the curve, I've got this." Like, it was not on my radar as something that I should worry about. At that point, didn't have a whole lot of friends with babies, so I hadn't heard that I wasn't aware that breastfeeding is a struggle for many or even most parents.
mm. Now, at the time that you took the breastfeeding class at the hospital, did you find the information that they presented useful?
I don't I think that at the time I did think it was useful. Again, I had 0 knowledge, so anything I was told felt now a few years later, even in soon after my son was born, in retrospect, I don't think the class was taught in a way that gave me the information that would have been helpful to me, taught in a way that was helpful to me. I'll get more into my story later, why that, but I think I took the class and I didn't question it. It's like,
Mm.
"Okay, I'm gonna feed my baby." We were given dolls, so I practiced bringing my doll to the chest, and that was about it until go time and my baby arrived.
Yeah, and I'm gonna go ahead and give a spoiler and say that you ended up founding a breastfeeding education company.
Yeah, I'll go more into that towards in a little bit, but my company is called Mighty Milk, and we offer online breastfeeding, baby feeding classes for expectant parents and also parents of newborns. And the classes are led by an amazing IBCLC named Lex Beach.
Yeah, and she was on 2 previous episodes of the podcast. I'll have those linked in the show notes. She is a friend of mine and somebody I've admired for years. So, the reason I bring that up now, give that little spoiler, is because would like you to think back to this initial breastfeeding education course. Was it independent from the childbirth ed course?
Yeah, we don't offer childbirth ed. Mighty Milk does
No,
not offer childbirth ed
but
classes.
the course that you took, at the hospital, was it independent from their childbirth education course?
Yes, it was a different course.
Okay, and so you mentioned practicing bringing a doll to your breast. Do you remember any of the other subject matter that was covered?
I don't remember any of the other subject matter that was
Mhm.
offered. There was a baby wearing component, and that was helpful because they had the different types of carriers, and we were able to see that. And baby wearing is such a great tool for breastfeeding and baby care in general. But aside from that, I don't remember
Okay.
very much about it. Mm,
Yeah, okay,
yeah.
so you had your class and then, you dive right in, so go ahead and tell me from your perspective how you thought breastfeeding went, and we'll just start with those very initial feeds.
Sure. So I ended up being induced at very close to 42 weeks, and my baby was born. Everything fell apart immediately.
Oh, no.
My husband and we were exhausted, first of all, but we were just totally blindsided. We just felt like we have this crying baby. We were like, where are the instructions? My baby, we did skin to skin right after he was born, but he never did the magical breast crawl. And he was super sleepy. I couldn't get him to latch. I was super hormonal and I had medication in my body myself, and the confusion and just the stress and overwhelm of those first really 48 hours after birth in the hospital, I wouldn't wish it upon anybody, yet it happens every day, all the time. I think a few nurses came in to try to help me breastfeed. It just wasn't going well. An IBCLC came in. I'm sure by the time she came in, I was, like, not even able to process what she was telling me because I was so worried about my son not eating anything. I was physically and I was still bleeding. I had preeclampsia, so I was constantly getting my blood pressure taken, and it felt almost like a hysterical entry into motherhood. And then my baby had lost about 10% of his weight by the time we get home, so I knew that we needed to monitor him closely. And so I went to my pediatrician to get him weighed, and my pediatrician had a really lovely IBCLC on staff who did everything she could to try to help me. But my baby was born in February and he kept losing weight. And so I'd have to get my postpartum body into the car in New England in February, bringing my tiny little newborn. When you're a new mom, you're trying to figure out how to get the baby into a car seat. You're trying to make sure your own body is, so you feel it's almost of it can be an out of body experience to have gone through birth. So there's that. So trying to get my baby into the car, knowing he's not the stress of knowing he's not gaining weight, going to the lactation consultant, going to the pediatrician, being told your baby still isn't gaining enough weight. It was just one of the hardest stretches of my life. And I was nursing my baby, but he ended up he just had lost too much weight. So at about 4 weeks, I started adding in supplemental formula, which is what was recommended by the lactation consultants and the pediatrician. And I was never and am never somebody who's anti formula. Um, the opposite. But I had felt very strongly that I had wanted to breastfeed. And I was taken off guard by my own desire to breastfeed after he was born. To me, it felt almost like an ancient birthright of mine to want to breastfeed. So
Mm,
I wasn't upset about feeding him formula so much as I was upset about this thing that to me felt like it was my right, and it felt like it had been just pulled out from under me. And I think combined with my when I was going through IVF, um, there's so much in IVF that feels out of your control. I had 2 miscarriages. It felt out of my control, and y in those moments, I just felt so powerless. And I think after my baby was born, to me, I realized breastfeeding felt like a way of taking back control. It felt like a way of this was my first relationship with my baby once he was out of my body, and
Mm.
this is something that I had wanted with him. And I was really devastated, not about the formula so much as this thing that I wanted to do, I felt robbed of. Not by anybody in particular, but in general, I I felt very strongly for no it wasn't about the benefits of breastfeeding, it wasn't about these magical, components that breast milk really does have. It wasn't for any one reason other than it felt like it mattered a lot to me.
Yeah, I can relate to that so strongly, and I think many people can, and this description of breastfeeding being a birthright feels so true for so many people. So many people cannot describe why they wanted to breastfeed so strongly. And the thing I try to remind my own clients is that, of course, you want to feed your baby from your body. That is a biological urge.
Yeah, so I'll sort of jump ahead a little bit. So I ended up just really struggling with my breastfeeding experience, and I was thinking back on the class that I had taken at my hospital and thinking about how it hadn't prepared me in the way that I felt would have been helpful to me. And so my background is in business and online marketing and content. And so I decided I'm going to create the class. I'm going to find somebody in IBCLC and I'm going to create the class with them that would have been exactly the class that I would have benefited from when I was pregnant. And so I ended up deciding to start my company, Mighty Milk. And I looked literally across the country for the perfect IBCLC to lead Mighty Milk's classes. I talked to a lot of people, and I ended up finding Lex Beach, who's an IBCLC, and she happened to live pretty much like less than a mile from me, which is amazing. But Lex has a really excellent reputation locally. And the first time I went to talk to Lex, I was telling her my story, why I wanted to find an IBCLC to create these courses with. And when I was telling Lex my story, she said that it's really good that you care about feeding your baby. It's really normal that this is upsetting to you because it's very important for from a survival perspective. Could you imagine what it would be like if we didn't care about feeding our babies? Like, it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective that feeding matters a lot
Mhm.
to and that we are very driven to feed our babies. And I think I had after feeding my baby and just that strong feeling like I had wanted to breastfeed, I felt, was questioning myself, like, why am I trying so hard? Why do I care this much about this thing? And I kind of questioned my own motivations and intentions and just questioned why I cared so much
Mm.
and felt a little strange about it. And Lex totally validated my feeling and just putting it into perspective. Yeah, it's actually a really good thing for our baby that we care that they're fed, as it turns out.
Yes. Yeah, that is such an important message because many of us feel very anxious about feeding babies and even bottle fed babies. Lots of questions on all the online mom groups about how much are you feeding, which is the best bottle, how do I know if they're getting enough, how do I know if they're getting too much, does my baby have an allergy, do I have undersupply, do I have oversupply? It could go on and on.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think at the intersection of, really knowing most of us or many of us in the US know so little about baby feeding and baby care, like, the intersection of that and, social media and all the messages we're get it's a tough place to be, and that's where I try to meet parents with Mighty Milk.
Mhm. Yeah, so take me back. How long would you say that your struggle with your first lasted? How long did it feel hard?
It felt hard for a year, and
Mm,
the reason it did is because, I ended up supplementing my baby with formula, like I said, in about 4 weeks, and his growth got better. I was still nursing him, but at about, um, 6 months, he started to refuse to nurse altogether, and I think my supply had really tanked at that point, so that was hard for me, but it made sense. But then I felt, for whatever reason, like I didn't wanna totally throw in the towel, and so I decided to switch to exclusive pumping, and I ended up pumping a couple times a day. I would get roughly an ounce, and I ended up doing that for about 5 months,
mm,
and I will come out and say, I hated pumping, I still hate it to this day. I think that we accept pumping, and many parents wanna pump, and that's totally fine and great, but for me personally, I hated the feeling of the pump. I hated seeing the milk just slowly drop in the pump. I found it was so discouraging. It felt nothing like holding my baby at my body. It was a totally different experience than nursing, and I hated cleaning the bottles. There was nothing about pumping that I liked, but I pushed myself to keep doing it because this is how much I cared about feeding my baby from my body. Whether it was healthy for me, whether it was necessary, is a different question, but that was how strongly I felt about it. At about 11 months, my husband and I had a conversation. He said, I if you wanna keep doing it, do it, but you don't seem happy, you don't seem like you're enjoying it, and I was like, "Oh my god, you're right, I don't have to do this anymore. I'm barely getting any milk, and it's making me miserable, so why would I keep
mm.
going with this?" And I would say that it was tough for a year, and honestly, though, it's still tough when I think back on it because, and this is one of my reasons for starting Mighty Milk, feeding isn't just about milk. It's not just about what you feed your baby. My one of my favorite quotes from Lex in our class, I'm going to paraphrase, but it doesn't only matter that we feed our babies. It also matters how we feel about feeding our babies. And so, after all my IVF struggles, after my miscarriages, my entry to motherhood, my postpartum life was colored. Of course, I love my baby so much, and of course, I had wonderful bonding moments with him. Um, but the fact is that if I had not had the stress of him not gaining weight, if I hadn't had the stress of lugging him to the lactation consultant in the freezing cold weather, if I hadn't felt like my body had failed me, it would have been a much more calm transition to postpartum life and to motherhood.
Mm. Yeah, and you used the word hysterical when you first told your story, that you just had a hysterical entrance into motherhood, and this is so common, and many of us feel like something is wrong with us, that we can't enjoy this baby that we have hoped for so long. And I know having difficulties with conception and previous losses colors that feeling of guilt even more. I've heard many people say that. And what we don't recognize when we're going through it is that none of the struggles are actually our fault. It's actually, we can place blame, but it's not on us as individuals. There's a lot of systemic failures that lead to difficulties feeding our babies. But when you're in the midst of it, that doesn't matter. You're just trying to get milk in your baby's tummy.
That's exactly right. But luckily, my story does get better.
Mm.
Not with my first baby, although I now have perspective on it,
Yeah, could I
but Mhm,
before you tell your second story, so you start supplementing at 4 weeks, right?
mhm.
And I know you were seeing an IBCLC at the pediatrician. What sorts of ideas was she giving you about how you could increase his intake so that he was meeting the growth expectations? while still maintaining your own sanity. Did you work on that together? What were the sorts of supports that were being provided?
Yeah, so we tried a few different things. Looking back now, I believe what happened was that I didn't understand from the beginning that I was supposed to nurse my baby very frequently. I did not understand that he was supposed to be swallowing, and or I didn't understand what newborn swallowing sounded like. So I thought my baby had been getting lots of milk because he had been moving his jaw like this. Like, his mouth looked like it was moving, and so every time we'd get a weight check, I'd be like, "I don't understand how he's losing weight. He's drinking lots of milk." But he was just chilling at my boob, moving his jaw around. Oh, now that I'm an experienced breastfeeder, I know what newborn swallowing sounds like, but when you have n had 0 exposure or very little exposure to a newborn breastfeeding, you don't know what a newborn swallowing sounds like, and I think that I probably what happened with him was that I think I make enough milk, I'm able to make enough milk for my baby, but I don't have an abundant supply of milk, and so my baby wasn't he was super sleepy, he wasn't removing enough milk, and so then I really wasn't making enough milk, um, and I think that I missed the window of the first week or so that's really can be crucial for setting yourself up for success. And so by the time I was really getting a whole lot of help from a lactation consult, of course, it works better for some people who struggle in the beginning. But for me, I believe I missed those first really crucial milk removal that window, and it was just not something I could crawl back to. And so her suggestions were power pumping, which I did try. And I did it a lot, and it was horrible. I know this is a way I know that some people are fine with power pumping and it works well for them. For me, it was miserable, especially for somebody struggling with low supply. It's so discouraging for me. It was so discouraging for me to see just that milk just dip, dip, and it meant that it was time I wasn't spending with my baby. It was time I was hooked up to this machine.
So was
Um,
she asking you to both feed your baby from your body and add in power pumping on top of it?
Yeah, I think that's what it was. She was also
Mhm.
trying to help me with his lat. I had just a lot of nipple pain. She was trying to help me with a lot of different things. She did recommend an SNS. I can't remember which brand, but we tried a few different ways of supplementing and feeding, and it just ended up, I just never was able to get my supply up to where it was enough to feed my baby only
Mm.
from my body.
Yeah, and, was there a phalange fitting session ever?
There wasn't a phalange fitting session. I This was in 2019. I think now it's becoming a lot more common, but I do not remember having a phalange fitting.
Mm. Yeah, that's really a shame. I see a lot of people on the mom groups say, "I've already met with an IBCLC. They didn't provide me the information I needed." And we all have various expertise, and so one IBCLC might be fantastic for somebody and might not be the right person for someone else. However, when you're in that time of just trying to feed your baby, you don't have time to be bouncing from provider to find the person who is the right fit for you. And when you've gone to see somebody who everybody says, go see an IBCLC, and it still isn't really helping in the end, that can be so discouraging.
Definitely. I think one of the reasons I struggled so much with the idea of power pumping is because I was alone in my house.
Mm,
By 3 weeks, my husband was back at work, and maybe if he had been home or if I had grandparents home and I had somebody else to hold the baby while I was power pumping, that would have been a different scenario. But everybody is in their own unique situation, and some people, for what seems palatable or doable to one person, might seem so overwhelming and stressful to another person.
Yeah, exactly. And I like to always remind people, if the advice you're being given is something that you could find by going on to Kelly Mom to try, or the plan you come up with, you could have easily come up with yourself, then you can go back to that provider and say, hey, I need something that's a little more doable for me. How can we figure this out? Okay, so you struggled through that. You struggled for almost a year. I want to say that pumping for 5 months while getting 1 ounce total in the day, you said?
I think per session, but probably
Okay.
zero point 0.5 to 1 ounce it. Yeah.
Yeah, that is incredible dedication. And
Thank you.
probably if you were getting higher volumes of milk, you would not have hated pumping so much, but to go through all of that work for a half ounce to an ounce each session is truly incredible. And it's a great reminder that any amount of milk that you can and are willing to provide your baby, human milk, helps them and is good for them. And, I don't know if you were holding on to that while you were working so hard to produce those few ounces a day, but it really is truly incredible that you continued for that long.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And in retrospect, it was incredible. I don't know that it was always so healthy, but I think it showed me my own drive to hold on to feeding my baby in the way that I had wanted to.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And, we each have to answer that question individually, what's healthy for us and what is not. And sometimes the choice we make is not the absolute healthiest in absolute terms, but it is the thing we needed to do in that moment,
Definitely.
given where we were in the decision tree.
Mm, yep.
Yeah. Okay. So now you have a redemptive second experience. Did you create the course? You did create the course before your second experience.
Yes. So I had this terrible experience. I teamed up with Lex. We filmed 2 classes. We worked for a long time on each they're very logical to follow. They are broken down into short videos, so you can watch them, with your partner from if you have a partner or any other support person, you can watch them from your couch. Um, and it's like Netflix for learning about breastfeeding and body feeding. And so Lex and I worked on the class together, and she wrote the class, and I brought the layperson perspective of what does this mean, or I'm not sure what you mean by this, or just questions that I had. So I think having both a regular person perspective and an IBCLC leading the class paired well together. And so Lex led these classes that were the exact classes that I needed and I wanted. So it was sort of bittersweet for me because I didn't have them, but it is amazing to be able to go help other families, and we've gotten incredibly positive feedback from the class, and that was really special and really helped me grapple with my own breastfeeding journey with my first baby, because even though it hadn't gone the way that I had wanted to, it allowed me to change the journey for other families. But so by the time I had my second baby, we had filmed and finished the prenatal class, and then a class for parents of newborns really in that 0 to 12 week phase. So by the time I had my second baby, Lex and I had filmed these classes. And so I knew quite a lot about how to breastfeed your baby at that point. And but I still went into this birth thinking that breastfeeding wasn't going to work for me. Honestly, it didn't even occur to me that it would go well, because I truly thought that my body was incapable of producing enough milk for my baby. I didn't know why, but that was just what I thought because that was my first experience and only experience. So when I was quite pregnant, I think about 38, Lex suggested that I practice doing prenatal hand expression, and it's something that we talked about in our class. And so I went in the shower. I didn't save my milk or anything like that, but I practiced hand expressing my milk, and I got like all this like amazing colostrum just from some hand massage in the shower. And that was a game changer for me because
Mm.
I was like, I'm doing it. Like I'm already doing it. My body is working. It's making colostrum. It's in there. And it was a really big confidence booster for me. And in our class breastfeeding for expectant parents, we have a footage of a very pregnant person expressing their colostrum and how Lex teaches how to actually do. And I cannot recommend it enough. Whether you're a first time parent, make sure you check with your doctor or midwife to make sure that it's something that is okay for you to do. But especially if you have struggled with breastfeeding in the past, it can really be such a big confidence boost. And so I was induced for the second time at about 42 weeks, and my baby came out. And for the most part, breastfeeding was amazing.
Mm.
Now, I don't want to say it was perfect. There were a few little hiccups. I was so lucky that Lex lived about a quarter mile, excuse me, a quarter mile away from the hospital where I gave birth. My baby was not latching easily. And so she came over. She had me use a nipple shield one time, and that kind of flipped a switch for my baby. And I did not have any issues from that point forward with latching. It was just like he just needed a little coaching. And I did have some other hiccups. I had retained placenta that
Mm.
had to be removed. And so that did impact my supply. But for the most part, everything went smoothly. Those intense weight gain issues that I had with my first baby were not, that was not my experience with my second baby, especially once I had resolved my retained placenta issue. And I was able to breastfeed with no nipple pain at all after weight gain went well. And not only that, but my whole transition to postpartum life with my second baby was a totally different experience than it was for my first,
Mm.
because there wasn't that intense adrenaline of mixed with the cocktail of hormones
Mm.
that my baby was not gaining enough weight, and I was so freaked out about how the next feed was going to go, and I didn't know what to do. And the other thing is really what Lex teaches in Mighty Milk's class, which is different from any other breastfeeding class taken, and I've checked out a bunch of them, is Lex teaches a wholly different vision for what breastfeeding should look like than many parents experience. So, with my first baby, I fed him every 2 to 3 hours. I'd look at the clock. If he was rooting, I would feed him, but I didn't think I was feeding him on a schedule, but I really was, because I would go by the clock. Um, and I would sit in a chair, hunched over with the nursing pillow. My back was hurting me because I was all hunched, and I would feed him for 15 minutes on each side exactly, and I would have my breastfeeding tracker, and I'd mark down the time. I would keep my whole diary, and that's what feeding looked like for me, to the extent that I was nursing for my body. Now, with my second, again, I had been the beneficiary of Mighty Milk's classes, my own company that I started. But what Lex teaches is such a different vision than that. And it is looking at your baby for hunger cues. It's understanding that it can be totally normal to feed your baby 12 times a day or 20 times a day, that you don't have to sit in a chair for any prescribed length of time, that the key is to feed your baby frequently and focus on their active swallowing, trying to keep them active at the breast. That you don't have to feel like you're sitting there for the entire day with your baby's nipple in your in with your nipple in your baby's mouth. That you can lie on your bed and nurse on your side. You can get out of the chair. You shouldn't be uncomfortable and hunched over. You can nurse on a couch, that your body should be supported by pillow, and that it's not this timed thing where you're looking at the clock and just using it to guide how you feed your baby, that you're using your baby to guide how you feed your baby. And with my first baby, I had all of these milk supply problems and I was tracking everything even before I had to supplement with formula. I used a breastfeeding tracker religiously. With my second baby, I didn't have milk supply problems and I used no tracker, and I was not looking at the clock at all. And it was also such a different experience because I was so much more cued into my baby when I knew to look at my baby. And so with my first baby, where I would go to my chair, my increments sit there for half an hour at a time. With my second baby, I would feed him, I don't know, 20 times a day, maybe more, maybe not, maybe 15 times a day. I don't know because I wasn't counting. And I would feed him sometimes just for 3 minutes on a side and switch him off and feed him for 2 minutes on the next side. And I paid attention to whether he was swallowing. And it's such a it's such a different experience once you are in that kind of symbiotic relationship, once your baby is the driving feeding, and once you're looking at them and reading their cues and understanding them, it's like this magical transformation. At least it was for me.
Yes. I I work at a hospital 2 days a month, so not very frequently, but I'm on the postpartum floor 2 days a month, and on every single whiteboard, it's written, "Feed baby 2 to 3 hours a day, 15 minutes on each side," and these are averages. These numbers come from research, from studies in which they took a bunch of babies and they asked parents to describe how frequently they feed and for how long. And they took all of the data and then created averages. And I always try to counteract this message when I walk into rooms by saying, hold your baby skin to skin, and whenever your baby shows any sign, early sign of hunger, eyes moving in the sockets, starting to smack their lips or turn their head towards you, go ahead and feed them. There's going to be no harm done in trying. And the biggest harm is if you're having nipple pain and you need help figuring out why that nipple pain is happening, because feeding a baby that frequently while you're in pain is not sustainable.
Absolutely.
And
Right.
parents who are incredibly anxious about supply and number of feedings, I always try to encourage them to just stop tracking. Put away the app. It doesn't matter. You're going to know much more about your baby and how your baby is doing by just focusing on your baby and not on inputting every single data point into an app.
Right, and in Mighty Milk's class, Lex gives an example of a culture where breastfeeding is really the norm, not bottle feeding. And she talked about how when you ask mothers in those cultures how often in a day they feed their baby, they're like, they just laugh. It's like, what? I don't know. I'm always feeding my baby, the newborn. And I think having that perspective that in breastfeeding cultures, the way they feed their babies looks nothing like the way babies are commonly fed in our culture. It can open up your world and give a different perspective of what feeding can look like for you. And that's one of the reasons Lex is one of the reasons I love how she leads Mighty Milk's classes is she gives this different vision. And it might not be for everybody, but for those who really do want to feed their babies from their bodies, if you really care about breastfeeding, it can really be an aha moments. And
Did it?
it made such a difference for me, that change in attitude for how I felt about feeding my baby, because I was able to focus so much on him, and it was about our relationship and our feeding relationship.
Yeah, that does make a huge impact in how you feel about baby feeding, parenthood, yourself, your own body. This idea that you had, even going into the second pregnancy, that even though you had done all this work to create a class that would help others find success, you still in the back of your mind felt like you would not be one of the ones who found success because it felt like there was something wrong with your body. Instead of thinking, man, that really turned south because I didn't have all the right information I needed and I didn't get the right supports at the right times to be able to be successful. We so often blame ourselves and our bodies. We almost disconnect ourselves from it because it's too painful to say, I failed, which none of us are failing when we're feeding our baby. So instead of even saying, I failed, I hear so many people say, my body failed me, like this disconnection, this disembodiment, because it's too painful to think that it was actually me that had the difficulty.
Right, absolutely, and that I I think that one thing I've noticed with some other breastfeeding classes is that they make guarantees that breastfeeding.
Mm.
I, through Mighty Milk, guarantee that our classes will give a boost in confidence, but I never, ever would guarantee that breastfeeding will, quote unquote, go well, because I think that's just so disingenuous and dishonest, and it sets parents up to be disappointed, because the fact is that you can be super prepared. You can know everything there is to know with about breastfeeding. You could take all of the prenatal classes in the world, and feeding can still be really difficult or not go in the way that you had wanted it to go. But the reason that I care so much about this is because I think that even with Mighty Milk, my hope is, and what I've seen from our customers, is that even if feeding doesn't go well, because there can be all sorts of different challenges, even if it doesn't go well, if you have that kind of base language, like I was talking before, if knowledge of the fundamentals of how of feeding frequency, of how to position your baby, of whether how to understand if your baby's getting enough milk, all of those things and more, that if you do need help from a lactation consultant, you're in a much better position to advocate for yourself and for your baby, because nobody can guarantee, and nobody should guarantee, that feeding will go well.
Mm.
And I think that we can validate how people feel about their feeding journey. If they are struggling, we can validate that it's really hard to feel that way, while also giving them the tools to help them make the best of their own situation, and help them feel as good as possible about the way that they're feeding their baby.
Yes, absolutely. Um, I tell every client that calls me and is struggling, I always say, I cannot guarantee that this problem will go away or that it will improve to the extent that you hope it does, but I can guarantee that I will help you feel really good about the decisions you make given your unique set of circumstances, that you'll feel empowered to make the right decisions and you'll feel good about the decisions that you have made and have a deeper understanding of your situation. And that's really what any provider can guarantee. They can either do those things or not, but none of us in any situation can guarantee absolute success or meeting of goals in any medical situation for sure, but in most other situations as well.
Right. I also think it's important to normalize and even suggest to parents that they should expect to reach out to an IBCLC.
Mm.
If feeding goes smoothly, they don't have any issues, great, awesome. But if you expect that you're going to visit an IBCLC, if you, before you give birth, you have talked to local parents, you have some good recommendations, you have the name and number of an IBCLC in your phone before you even give birth, all of these things can stress the process and de-stress feeding if you do experience challenges. Even I even got a lactation certification before I gave birth to my second baby. I had these Mighty Milk classes, but I still got help from Lex that was really useful. And so I think having families expect to see a lactation consultant, understand it's a frequent occurrence. There's nothing, it's a good thing to go get help. People can check on their insurance ahead of time, all that stuff. And it just, again, just de-anxietyfies, that's not a word, but de-stresses the whole situation.
Yes, absolutely. And most of the time, insurance will even cover prenatal consultations within IBCLC. And then you already know who it is you're going to call when that time comes, because we all expect to see our pediatrician. Almost all of us want our pediatrician to be able to answer questions about baby feeding. And most people don't know how little training pediatricians have in being able to help. And it's not really malicious. They just don't know what they don't know. And you were in an amazing situation that IBCLC support was offered by your pediatrician's office. But for most people, that is not the case. So we really have to self advocate to find those people who can help us with our difficulties.
Definitely. One of the chapters in Mighty Milk's class, Lex talks about who to trust with feeding advice. And she talks about IBCLCs, of course, because there are many different levels of certification in the lactation world. So she talks about that. And she does talk about the fact that pediatricians are not lactation experts. They only receive a couple hours of training in lactation. And parents trust pediatricians. And it's not that they're trying to do anything evil, but sometimes they don't refer to an IBCLC. And so, even just explaining to parents, this is who you should contact if you're struggling with pumping or IBCLCs exist, and they're a great resource if you're struggling. So, that's something that Lex talks about in Mighty Milk.
Yeah, awesome. And the price point for Mighty Milk is really good. It's very affordable for anyone who's interested in taking a course.
Yeah, I feel very strongly that I don't want Mighty Milk to be exclusive. I think that anybody who wants to feed their babies from their bodies should be able to have the information that helps them to do that. And so, if you're interested in Mighty Milk's classes, I highly recommend you check them out. We have all sorts of people who take our classes, and they're used by birth centers, doulas, even for their own training, as well as to recommend to clients. Of course, they're used by families. I have a couple of pediatricians that send their clients to the class. You can find out more at mightymilk.co, that not .com. I think Pepsi owns mightymilk.com, but mightymilk.co.
Awesome. Great. That'll all be linked in the show notes. And I highly recommend that anyone who is pregnant or planning to feed a baby check them out, because they are really great resources. I haven't had the chance to take the full course, but I have gotten to see pieces of it. And I would trust Lex to teach any lactation course because she really is so good. So I really appreciate you taking your struggle and turning it into something that so many people can use and apply to their lives and feel like it enhances their experience as new parents.
Thank you so much, Lo.
This has been awesome. Thank you. A story like Kate's shows us that things can improve. A story like Kate's demonstrates that the right support, the right education, the right resources can make a difference between meeting your goals and not meeting your goals. Now, of course, we don't have a time machine. We cannot go back to Kate's first experience and see if things would be different had she gotten different supports, had she had breastfeeding education that felt more impactful. But a story like hers really goes to show that seeking out the right types of supports can really help you feel good about your breastfeeding experience. And I've got great news. Now you can go right onto my website and book a consultation with me automatically. No more going back and forth about schedule, texting and emailing to see what works. You can check out my calendar, book a day. It'll pop up into my calendar, and then I'll get you the intake forms. So if you have a breastfeeding difficulty that you would like to explore with me, reach out, book now. Why suffer any more than you have to? And if you're thinking, Lo, I would love to, but I'm not in Massachusetts, don't worry about it. I offer virtual insurance-covered lactation consultations. Don't let your location be a barrier to getting great lactation care. I can't wait to help you feel better about the way you are feeding your baby and feel confident in the decisions you are making as a breastfeeding parent. See you soon.